Bates has been unmuted, so we better get started. Absolute pleasure to see so many familiar faces here today. Some of them going way back, others fairly recent, I'd say. But yeah, I'm Greg Smith from the Department of Pacific Affairs, and I'm standing in for Ben Hillman, who is in China at the moment, and hopefully will come back happy and safe. Now, sorry, that's a joke. Ben will be fine. He doesn't have a naughty podcast. Now, Bates is one of my longtime associates. I don't think we've ever actually been in the same gangway at the same time, but we seem to kind of vaguely track each other. He was at Sydney for quite a time, and in his latest deal, which is I think quite a coup, he gets the kudos and the privilege of working for the Asia Society based in New York without having to be based in New York, and also no longer having to work for Kevin Rudd. Did I say that out loud? I did. But anyway, Kevin, in his wisdom, has given Bates the title of the Executive Director of the Centre for China Analysis at the Asia Society. And one of his first acts is this fabulous book, Shameless Plug. Do go out and buy it, presumably available online. And you don't need to read it if you listen for the next hour and a half. There's plenty more winning pages. And yeah, so you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to Bates. So I'll hand over without any further ado.
All right, thank you very much.
About struggle.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Graham. And let me thank everybody for taking time to join us this afternoon. Let me extend my gratitude as well to Ben, Sharon, to the entire team here at CCIW for the opportunity to be here. I also want to thank a couple of colleagues from the Asia Society Policy Institute who joined us this evening, Richard Maud, who many of you, of course, would know, as well as Dominique Fraser, who are colleagues with the Asia Society Policy Institute, but based here in Australia, and who helped organize a big day for me here in Canberra, including this opportunity to speak at the center. Just a word or two about the Center for China Analysis, if I could, just because we've got so many China experts here in the room. Yeah, this was the brainchild of your current ambassador to Washington, the Honorable Dr. Kevin Rudd, who, as you may know, had been previously the head of the Asia Society Policy Institute for 8 years, and more recently, for the past 2 years, the president and CEO of the Asia Society, the entire global organization. And he, about a year or two ago, raised the money and put in place and helped establish this new Center for China Analysis, invited me about 6 or 7 months ago to join and lead that team as executive director. And the Center for China Analysis has grown very, very rapidly. We're now about a little bit more than 30 full-time and part-time China analysts within the center, which makes us, by my reckoning, one of the largest, if not the largest, China shops of any think tank in the United States. And we're doing our work across 5 pillars: China's domestic politics, China's economy, China's foreign policy and national security, China's energy and environment policy, and then 5th, China's society, culture, public health, and education. Not all the pillars are fully stood up quite yet, so we're continuing to grow. But I highly recommend and hope you will have a chance to visit our website. There are a couple of active and quite, I would say, innovative and pioneering and interactive websites that you can turn to. One that's become already the most popular and most visited site of the Asia Society website is called Decoding the 20th Party Congress, which is basically a website that goes in depth in terms of elite politics, understanding the leadership of China, both in the party and the government across a range of policy issues. And we're going to continue to expand that out. I think it's going to be a great resource for those of you following Chinese elite politics. But there's a lot more. Please have a look at our website and let me know what you think, and give us your feedback as we continue to try and grow and be a a resource for the international community in understanding China. Our mantra is China from the inside out, which I know everyone here will understand and appreciate, that we try to do our best to apply, our skills in Chinese language, our skills in having lived and worked in China, our networks, and so on with interlocutors in China to help understand what's happening in the country and translate that into analysis and understanding of how China's operating in the world. All right, enough about the Center for China Analysis. Let me talk a little bit about this book, Daring to Struggle, China's Global Ambitions under Xi Jinping. So this book came out a few months ago with Oxford University Press, and it was my attempt to try and look back upon 10 years of China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping, and from that analysis, make some judgments about what we could expect, what we should expect in terms of China's foreign policy and engagement with the international community going forward, still under Xi Jinping. The reason I wrote the book was because I thought, how's that doing? Good. The reason I wrote the book was because I had not until that time seen a book which was written in a style or I hope an accessible style that would be enjoyed and appreciated, appealing to a broad audience, not only of my academic and think tank colleagues, but also hopefully to a broader audience of business persons, policymakers, and even the educated public that wanted to have a relatively quick read, but get an in-depth understanding of developments inside China, especially during the Xi Jinping era, and how they have affected China's approach to the world. I also didn't want to write a book that was mainly about, or that was mostly targeting any particular country, i.e. the United States. I did not want to write a book that was only interesting to the inside the Beltway crowd. I've done a few of those, and I wanted to make it a much more broadly appealing. But then I was faced with the conundrum of, okay, now that you have a sort of broad audience in mind, how are you going to organize the book in a way that's makes sense, that you can point to as hopefully analytically rigorous, but still retains that appeal. And there are different ways of approaching that, right? You can, I think the traditional way in a book about foreign policy is you do a chapter on relations with the United States, you do a chapter on relations with Southeast Asia, you do a chapter on relations with Europe, right? Or you could organize it around functional matters, right? What's China's approach to the climate crisis? What's China's approach to non-proliferation? What's China's approach to regional security affairs, arms control, et cetera? I didn't want to go either direction. And so I had to think a little bit harder about identifying what I think are the principal drivers or motivations which undergird or drive Xi Jinping's approach to the outside world. What are the major objectives of this foreign policy under Xi Jinping? And again, you could slice and dice that a lot of ways. I came up with six. I came up with six sort of ambitions or six objectives, which in my view encompass and help organize our thinking around what China's up to in the international community, especially under Xi Jinping's leadership. And I came up with, wrong way, sorry. I came up with this graphic in the book. And there you'll see the six principal ambitions as I defined them. And I depicted graphically as a Venn diagram for two reasons principally. One, of course, the pursuit of these objectives are not independent of one another. Obviously, they overlap with, sometimes provide synergies with one another, but in any event are not standalone, entirely standalone objectives. That was one reason why I sort of came upon this graphic as a way of depicting my thinking. And secondly, the most important, where the 6 ambitions or objectives most overlap is at the center, and that is the pursuit of legitimacy as a core element of China's engagement with the international community. A couple of caveats. In some ways, none of these 6 objectives are new. We can or nor are they unique to China, for that matter. And we can point throughout parts of Chinese contemporary history where these objectives in China's foreign policy have surely been pursued in the past. But I think what differentiates the situation today are 2 things. One, what I would say is a far greater degree of political will, especially under Xi Jinping's leadership, to more assertively and aggressively seek to achieve these objectives. So political will is, I think, an important differentiation in today's era, but also importantly, a greater resources, financial, diplomatic, military, with which to pursue these objectives. So you put those 2 together, and I think these pursuits become a far more important aspect of how China is prosecuting its international affairs, and of course then has a far more greater meaning to the rest of us who have to interpret them, understand them, and sometimes even be the target of them. So that's basically the central construct of the book. We go through 6 chapters, and then towards the end comes the so what question. What does it all mean, and what should we do about it? So let me just quickly rattle through some of these about what I mean exactly by these things. So what do I mean by legitimacy? In my view, this is the most important driver of China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping. And what I mean by this is basically maintaining and bolstering the legitimacy, survival, the respect of the Chinese Communist Party. In the book, I talk about how this is pursued with 2 principal audiences in mind, right? Of course, there's the foreign audience, trying to convince foreign audiences through their foreign policy activities that the party is legitimate, deserves respect, indeed, even approbation, maybe even appreciation for what China has done domestically and what the party has done internationally. The second important audience, maybe more important audience, of course, is the audience at home. And importantly, a subset of the domestic audience, namely the 95 million or so members of the Chinese Communist Party, that what China is doing abroad should grant the party legitimacy and respect and continued mandate to rule inside China. In the book, I talk about how is that expressed then, both at home and abroad. How does China seek through foreign policy activities to gain this legitimacy? And I talk about 4 sort of foundational foreign policy narratives: ideological, aggrieved nationalism, performance, and cultural. So in other words, only the Chinese Communist Party fully understands the tides of history and can safely navigate not only the party, but the Chinese nation through those shoals of history to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, because we understand best the ideological tides of history are in our favor. Aggrieved nationalism, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Only the Chinese Communist Party could have saved China from the depredations of the foreigners, reversing the 100 years of humiliation and putting China back on a path to its rejuvenation, and importantly, never be bullied again by outside forces. The performance narrative, only the Chinese Communist Party could have been as successful as it has been in putting China back onto the path of wealth generation and prosperity, and leading to China's remarkable economic success story. And only under the party's leadership can we continue to expect such performance and economic development. And lastly, this is somewhat more recent for the party, but it's interesting, and it is expressed in its foreign policy relationships as well as in its legitimation narratives at home. Only the Chinese Communist Party is in a position to preserve, foster, and sort of sustain the cultural legacy, the remarkable cultural legacy of the Chinese people, in terms of its history, its language, its technological achievements, all the great cultural attributes of the Chinese civilization can be saved, preserved, and promoted because the party is there to do it. That's a little more difficult, obviously, narrative to achieve credibility, given what the party once thought about China's past and its cultural heritage. But nevertheless, the party today is taking this on board. And I think, just to use an example, Confucius Institutes, for example, are just one way how the party is trying to push this narrative in its relationships abroad. So legitimacy, and you'll hear me talking a great deal more about legitimacy and its importance in China's foreign policy. Second, sovereignty. And what I mean by sovereignty is not simply the narrow definition, I would say, of claiming territory, of seeking to move borders in alignment with China's understanding of the historical record and its claims to sovereignty, but a wider definition of sovereignty, which I sort of talk about the ability to expand strategic frontiers and gain greater room for maneuver on the international stage. It's interesting, in the book I talk about how China, even more so than sort of the founders of the Westphalian system, today embrace the precepts of the Westphalian system in ways far more strongly than others. And this really arose, of course, out of the century of humiliation in an effort to use the Western notions of sovereignty as a way of protecting the Chinese nation. And today, the PRC is probably one of the strongest proponents of Westphalian notions of sovereignty, especially to the degree that those notions protect the party from outside interference. Obviously, the pursuit of sovereignty, as I've defined it, has enormous implications for China's foreign policy and relationships with many of its key neighbors, such as Japan, such as the other claimants in the South China Sea, such as with across the Himalayas with India and Nepal. And of course, while some people would disagree with me that this is a sovereignty issue, its relationships with Taiwan. But more than that, even parts of the country which most of the world would agree are a part of China, over which there is no widespread dispute over whose territory it is. Nevertheless, even within China, there are internal disputes about sovereignty. There are elements of contestation, even within China, about whether or not the regime in Beijing indeed has the proper mandate or legal authority to exert its sovereignty over parts of China, like Hong Kong, or Tibet, or in Xinjiang. And there too, China's assertions of sovereignty and control over those territories, while again, most of the world accepts are a part of China, nevertheless reverberate well beyond China's national borders and affect China's foreign policy and international relationships in very, very serious ways. Third, wealth. I mean, the objective through their international relationships to generate economic prosperity and national wealth. Very important elements, and here we see the overlap quite clearly across the different objectives, because of course, generation of national wealth and prosperity has a direct impact on the continued legitimacy of the party, the so-called performance narrative. And of course, it has real impact on China's ability to develop its hard power, which we'll talk about next. Interestingly, in this pursuit of wealth and power, China, in comparison to other emerging economies over the past 30 to 40 years, was dependent on the outside world to a far greater degree than other contemporary emerging economies over the past 30 or 40 years. Far more dependent upon international or foreign inputs to its national domestic success, economic success story. So what do I mean? You know, access to technology, access to foreign capital, access to foreign know-how, access to foreign technologies and investments, and importantly, of course, access to foreign markets. All of these foreign inputs are right at the center of China's economic success story and continue to be so today, although we know that that is changing and changing quite quickly, both as a result of actions that China itself has chosen to take to become less dependent on the outside world for its economic success and to rely more on a domestic market and indigenous innovation, et cetera, but also as a result of decisions taken in other capitals, right, to rethink their economic relationship with China and to lessen their dependency on the relationship, their economic relationship with China. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see over the coming decades how China pursues its foreign policy in generating wealth and national prosperity, even as that old model of very heavy dependence on its international relationship diminishes and becomes more difficult to sustain. In the pursuit of its economic wealth and generation of prosperity, of course, huge impact on how China operates within the international system. And just a few examples I talk about in the book, of course, are the Belt and Road Initiative, you know, the impact of the Made in China 2025 initiative, and how China has chosen to try and maintain access to foreign markets, you know, for investment, for acquisition of technologies and companies, and having access to advanced technologies. All of these are elements of its foreign policy that try to help achieve this very important objective of wealth generation. And then segueing to the next point about the next objective of power, you know, the generation of wealth and prosperity directly contributes then to this fourth key objective of China's foreign policy. I call it power, leveraging growing and economic military might in a way to promote China's national interests. In the book, when I talk about power, I'm not talking about soft power, which I talk about a little bit later, but rather hard power, and just reminding ourselves of Joe Nye's definition of hard power, meaning using coercion or inducement, so carrots or sticks or carrots, as a way to get others to do what you would like them to do. And in many respects, this is really where China's foreign policy toolkit is the strongest. Certainly in terms of economic inducement and economic coercion, China's been quite active in trying to use those tools in its foreign relationships to encourage others to align more closely with China's national interests. In the book, I go through chapter and verse about the examples that under Xi Jinping have been utilized in an attempt through inducement or coercion to get countries, companies, governments, and societies to line up more cleanly, or at least less in opposition to China's interests as the party has defined them. And I go into some detail about China's military modernization and how that is also becoming an increasingly frequently used instrument of coercion to try and get others to do China's bidding. Fifthly and sixthly, fifth is leadership, sixth is ideas. And here I'm beginning to get into, I think, somewhat new, and I found in the research and the writing of the book, I found it to be some of the most interesting elements of China's foreign policy pursuits. And what do I mean by leadership? What I mean here is attempting to have a greater say, in how the world operates, and having that say, obviously, in order to move the world system in a direction that's a little bit more conducive to and supportive of the party state's interests. I say it's a relatively new feature in China's foreign policy, and I guess by this I mean under Xi Jinping, it's quite clear that the sort of the old Dengist notion of keeping a low profile and not taking the lead has been completely abandoned under Xi Jinping. Instead, Xi likes to talk about approaching the center of the world stage, taking the lead and doing more. So that's clear that conceptually that's a major aspect of Xi Jinping's approach to its international relationship. But how does it manifest itself? In the book, I talk about, for example, its growing effort to play a larger role within the United Nations, both as either through financial contributions, but also stepping up to take on more leadership roles within the United Nations system. Although, to be fair, still doing it in a way that is, far less active or far less numerically speaking in terms of leadership as compared to other countries, like especially European and North American countries. But outside of the UN as well, seeing, I think, a much more proactive effort under Xi Jinping to exert leadership within the international community, especially through the process of creating what I'm calling Sino-centric multilateral frameworks, Sino-centric multilateral institutions and organizations. What am I talking about? Things like this was before Xi Jinping, but Xi has made this. He's given this a great deal more attention than his predecessors. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is one good example. The recent China-Arab Summit of last year is another good example. The creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the new development bank. Some people call it the BRICS bank. The effort last year, so far unsuccessful, by Wang Yi to establish a Sino-centric multilateral framework with the 10 countries in the Pacific Islands region that recognize China diplomatically. And there are other examples of this Sino-centric multilateralism, which is an example of China trying to take the lead and help foster economic development, help foster different approaches to regional security affairs and the like through the mechanism of these organizations. And in the book, I also go beyond sort of diplomatic multilateralism and also point to ways in which China is attempting to take the lead in certain areas of advanced technologies so as to set standards within those technologies and be able to be the market leader in cutting edge technological fields like quantum, AI, green technology, and otherwise. So leadership is another important pursuit that we can use as a category for understanding China's relations with the outside world under Xi Jinping. And then last, ideas. And this may well be one of the newest elements of Chinese foreign policy. That's not to say that China didn't promote certain ideas in the past. Just to take Maoism as an example, we know that, of course, the pursuit of ideas has always been an element of the pursuit and promotion of certain ideas has always been an element of Chinese foreign policy. But again, what's different today is the mandate that has been granted to agencies of the party and the government to promote these ideas, and the resources that have been given to them to see that these ideas are indeed promoted. In the book, I give a special focus to some very, very critical party organizations that have stepped up to a far greater degree under Xi Jinping to take on foreign policy roles. Each of these organizations have as one of their core mandates the cultivation of elites, both at home and abroad, in order to promote ideas and norms that are consistent with party interests. And I talk particularly about such organizations as the Propaganda Department, the United Front Work Department, the International Liaison Department, who have been given enormous resources to work abroad, to pursue party state foreign policy interests through the cultivation of foreign elites, and as Xi Jinping says, to tell China's story well and to gain international narrative, or some people translate this as discourse power, 国际话语权. That is to say, try to overcome the Western-dominated international narratives about what is and isn't the right form of governance, what is and isn't the correct relationship between a government and its people, what is and isn't the proper way to settle international disputes. And again, this all circles back to legitimacy and the need for the party to promote these ideas, to tell China's story well, to gain greater control of the international narrative in ways that are going to be more conducive to party state interests. I talk in the book about what some of these big ideas are that Xi and the Chinese leadership would like us to take on board and accept and respect and hopefully promote and appreciate. She talks about us being in a new era, which I interpret to mean an era in which China will emerge, as a far more powerful power, and one which will be respected and internationally appreciated in the world. He talks about building a community of shared future for mankind, which I think is a benign way of saying that we're all going to try to get along, aren't we? And China will be free from criticism or interference from those who don't respect or find legitimate its form of governance. Unity with diversity is another kind of a Confucian phrase, but which I interpret to mean, again, that the world does not have to follow a single model, that in fact the world will get along better if we come to accept that there are different models, different ways of governing, different ways for economic success and development, different ways of promoting sovereignty and security in the international system, and again, in ways that would be more conducive to China's interests. China also talks, another important big idea is the discussion of a Chinese solution, right? 中国方案, meaning people translate this differently. Some people call it Chinese wisdom. Some people call it Chinese model. Even Chinese translators have different English phrases. But the main point is that China has something to offer to the world. China's political and economic model might be worthy of emulation by some in the international community. Not that all should necessarily accept China's way of doing things, but at least the world community should respect and recognize that China has something to give. It has experience to share, and they shouldn't be prevented from sharing that with those in the international community that would like to learn from them. So these are big ideas, and you need look no further than to the statements coming out of Moscow today and yesterday as part of the Putin-Xi summit to see exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the promotion of big ideas, the promotion of a different set of understandings about how the world ought to be working. So those are the 6 objectives. We could number them in different ways. You can slice and dice this in lots of different ways. This is just the way I came up with. And I hope in my heart of hearts that it at least provides a kind of framework or a paradigm, which you can overlay on top of what is obviously very, very complex and difficult subject, understanding China's approach to the world, and at least give a little bit of analytical construct to understanding what it is we're seeing. So what? If I'm right that these are all important and the primary objectives of China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping, and that it's likely to continue in this frame, what does that mean for us? What does that mean for the world going forward? Can we expect more of the same, or will something be different? My own view is that even as these pursuits bump up against and create increasing tensions with the interests and values of other countries, and not just in the global West, but in other parts of the world, the question is, will China change course? Even as in vast parts of the world, and especially in the global West, but not entirely so, perceptions of China have turned dramatically negative. Perceptions of Xi Jinping himself have turned dramatically negative in a very short time, almost entirely coincident with Xi Jinping's time in power. This decline has occurred. And this is because, as I said, across these 6 fundamental aims, the very pursuit of which is running counter to the interests and values of many countries around the world. In other words, as these pursuits are sought, as these ambitions are sought, countries around the world are rethinking their relationship with China in very serious ways. And of course, Australia is just one of many in which that is true. Wolf warrior diplomacy, of course, is just one sort of manifestation then of this more ambitious pursuit of some of these goals. We see China asserting its sovereignty. We see China flexing its economic muscle for leverage. Again, Australia being a target of that, expanding military power and presence, increased exertions of leadership and soft power efforts, but increasingly also facing pushback and headwinds from around the world. So if the pursuit of these ambitions is creating a lot of headaches and difficulties and challenges for China's international relationships, should we expect some kind of accommodation, or should we expect some kind of moderation of these pursuits under Xi Jinping's leadership? And my conclusion is no, it's unlikely, because Xi Jinping and the leadership around him have concluded that in order to achieve the grand goal of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, China will have to double down and pursue these 6 ambitions even more assertively and forcefully going forward. In other words, taking from the title of the book, but more importantly, taking a phrase which Xi Jinping likes to use a lot, China must dare to struggle. It must wear that risk, dare to struggle, dare to win, and push back against these headwinds in pursuit of these ambitions and the ultimate goal of national rejuvenation. In my view, before I get to that, in my view, the strategic calculation is something like this. The risks entailed in doubling down and pursuing these ambitions on the pathway to national rejuvenation, or the hoped for achievement of national rejuvenation, the risks entailed in doing so are understood. But those risks in the strategic calculation are less than the risks that would be entailed in not doing so. In other words, if they were not to pursue these ambitions, then maybe national rejuvenation would not be possible. Maybe the party would not survive. Maybe China's sovereignty, wealth, power, ability to lead, and promotion of its ideas would be a failure. So it's not as if the leadership doesn't understand that what they're doing is risky. They surely do. That's why Xi Jinping calls on the party and the people to struggle and to be prepared for struggle going forward. It's just that those risks are worth it under this calculation, because not doing so would entail that all might be lost. So it's possible that you could construct a scenario in which this trajectory that I'm suggesting is in front of us could move in a direction in which we could achieve more constructive and beneficial relations with the PRC. It could give rise to a China in the future that is more prosperous and stable, even more just, and maybe more resolved to settling its international disputes and tensions peaceably. It's possible. But I don't think either PRC leaders or increasingly leaders in many other capitals around the world believe that such positive outcomes are likely. And so as a result, I think we should all be preparing ourselves for what is likely to be a long struggle going forward over what China wants. Xi Jinping thinks so, and he repeatedly tells us that we should expect that kind of a struggle going forward. So what do we do? This is the last slide. I don't go into great detail in this book with specific bullet point by bullet point policy recommendations, for the White House and for other capitals, but just 5 broad points. First, I think it's still important to understand that China faces enormous challenges. Yes, China is getting stronger. Yes, it's becoming a more powerful player internationally in many respects. But, a lot of challenges lie ahead. Surely the Chinese leadership acknowledges that. We should also be equally aware of those challenges and factor that into our calculus about our future relationship with China. I'm talking about whether or not China can address decreasing productivity, whether China can address this enormous demographic challenge that it faces. can China address some lingering internal security challenges that they continue to face? All of these are challenges and are elements of China's weakness, even though the country remains very powerful. Gaining strength in numbers. I think we see that occurring already, where let's call them like-minded countries of various types and stripes are finding some strength in partnering on various issues, in part to present something of a countervailing force that can counterbalance some of the unwelcome elements of China's foreign policy. I mean, the most obvious examples of that would be things like AUKUS and the Quad, but I think there are a lot of other examples of countries looking to each other to try and find partnership as a way of counterbalancing some elements of China's foreign policy. Building greater resilience within one's own domestic, political, and social circumstances, again, to try and deflect or mitigate some of the more unwelcome elements of China's ambitions. Fourthly, prepare for the competition of ideas. And by this, I mean, we should take very seriously that sixth ambition that China wants to promote certain ideas that are more consistent with its own interests and values. I'm not sure we in the global West or elsewhere in the world are entirely prepared for this. And we ought to be taking it seriously and trying to do a better job of making sure our ideas are not just ideas, but are actually backed by real success and vibrancy. And I think we've had some difficulties in doing that, obviously, in recent years. And then lastly, in spite of all of these sort of more contested relationship that I think we're entering into with China, that doesn't mean we should be abandoning cooperation. We should not abandon finding, identifying, and building ways for cooperation, working with China on issues of common concern. It's difficult. It's politically difficult, especially in the United States and other parts of the world. But I think it's something we ought to be all asking our leadership to be thinking about seriously, because obviously some of the major international challenges we face, global challenges we face, whether that's climate change or the next pandemic or dealing with global global poverty and the growing wealth gap, and assuring development assistance and loan forgiveness and non-proliferation. The list is long. None of these global challenges are going to get resolved if we ignore China's ability to contribute to them. It's just a matter of trying to find out how both China and the others in the international community see in their collaboration mutual benefit. I think it's possible. It's just going to be difficult, but we shouldn't give up on it. So with that, I'll close, and I thank you very much for the opportunity and look forward to the conversation.